This is the DRS train.
And we are back. I'm Peter Brook. I'm joined by Kyron Smith, NavF1 and Ace Shield, and you're listening to the DRS Train podcast. So, Australia has happened, and Formula One is finally back after a very long break. I didn't fancy getting up at 4 a.m. to watch it live, but I've got a replay, and all I can say is, what a way to start the season. I thought that was marvellous.
Yeah, it was a fantastic season opener, as it always is in Australia, and it showed again why Australia has to start the season. After 2 laps, we already had 3 DNFs, which has always happened in Australia, by the way. There has always been at least 3 DNFs, and it's fantastic. That's how a season should open. There should be some kind of jeopardy. There should be some kind of uncertainty in terms of who will finish. I think in Bahrain last year, and just Bahrain in the last 2 years, there just isn't enough going on. So fantastic to have Australia season again, and we saw it today.
Sorry, I completely agree with Nav. I think it was a great race, and it was so unpredictable because there were ebbs and flows. There were moments where the race was fairly processional, and then we really saw the drivers making mistakes and the weather, dictating some of the action. But then we also saw, basically, I think some drivers putting in some really good performances, and some drivers just not getting the most out of their package, which we can talk about. So the confluence of that led to a very strong Grand Prix.
Yeah. So we'll go as we did last year, just running team by team. So we'll start with the winning team, which was McLaren. I think that was kind of what a lot of people were expecting, but in the middle of the race, when it started to dry out, it became clear that their race pace is mighty. The way they pulled away from Max, Oscar, and Lando. Oscar's pace was good. He was pressuring him, and then there was a bit of team orders telling him to hold position, and then it just, for him at least, it just completely fell apart when the rain returned. But Lando, yeah, very good controlled race from the front.
Yeah, and that's where you see why Lando is meant to be the number 1 driver and is meant to be the more experienced driver. Oscar, I genuinely had some hope for him when he was closing on to Lando he was half a second behind him for at least 2 or 3 laps, and it seemed like it was going well, and then completely unraveled. At least he kept it going. Honestly, it was quite impressive to keep it going. I was sure that he was beached there. And at least he made that fantastic move on Lewis at the end, which shows that there is a very good driver in there, just still too inconsistent. And, this is the banker for him. I said it last year as well. First season in Formula One, fair enough. Second season, suddenly into a top contender. You can see why there was inconsistency. But this season, he needs to be up to the task. And, generally in terms of pure pace, he seemed up there, but he needs to correct those small mistakes, and they will start making fewer of them, and Oscar needs to adapt very quickly now.
Yeah, well said. I agree with most of that. The big takeaway for me in this race was 2 things. I think a pecking order came out of this race. I think we know where the cars roughly now lie relative to each other, and I think we can safely say that we know which team has the fastest car in Formula One. So that McLaren is an absolute rocket ship. And yes, Max finished under a second or roughly a second behind Lando, but at one point in the race, Norris and Piastri had more than the length of the pit straight back to Max, while they were only separated by a second or so. I mean, the rest of the grid has some serious catch up to do, because if McLaren were able to pull a gap like that, if it wasn't for Max, I mean, this race would have been a total blowout, and that's concerning for the rest of the season, in my opinion. I think the only thing I'll say is that 2 things: Max exists, and Ferrari did not have a representative weekend either. Nav, any thoughts on that?
Would you say it's somewhat reminiscent of '97 with two Williams and Schumacher just using his pure skill to drag his car there.
Yeah, I think it's funny because the dynamic of this season could be like '97. I would say
Or
so, but
96.
or '96. But I think the race itself probably reminded me, honestly, Nav, more of '98, just because there were. But the difference is there was no third car in '98, so yeah, I guess you could say it's a bit like the '97 season in the way it's shaping up. The wild card is Ferrari. I think Ferrari have a very quick car, but as Vasseur himself honestly summed up after the race, they did not maximize their package. So who knows? Maybe Ferrari can challenge, but we'll have to see.
So Ferrari is the Jordan, which is very underwhelming for
Yeah.
them.
Yeah.
It was interesting though that it's because at the beginning and the end of the race, that was when Max was more or less with them. And you can say, well, maybe that's because he's just better in the wet, which, let's be honest, he is. But maybe the Red Bull handles the wet better, because right at the end, he was very close to him. He was on the main back straight, which is now really fast with the removal of that chicane. He was closing up to him without DRS at a rate of knots. And had he been slightly closer, he maybe could have gone for a dive bomb at turn 14 or whichever one it is on the final lap. But then, in the middle of the race, they got 15, 16 seconds out on him before the safety car. So in the dry, they're obviously faster, but in the wet, it does seem to be closer.
There's a big issue that I'm just seeing now, news from 30 minutes ago, that Norris had a badly damaged floor from that excursion before the pit sequence. So that was a big reason why Max was able to keep up. In the first stint, Max was able to keep up apparently mostly by overdriving and damaging the tires. And yeah, that's quite bad news if the floor was badly damaged and still Lando won. That means that McLaren could really, really be clear this year.
Yeah, that's ominous. And I mean, we saw it, and George Russell mentioned it after qualifying. McLaren, I think the way George put it was McLaren could seize all development now on their 2025 car and just switch over to 2026. That's not a good sign or omen for the rest of the season. And it comes down to what McLaren are doing with their tires in George's view. He thinks they're doing something special to get them fired up over one lap, and then as we saw in the race, they can make them last too. So we are looking at the prospect of a Lando Norris or Oscar Piastri championship, but on McLaren, they nearly threw it all away as well. So I wasn't that impressed with the drivers, more with the car. I mean, it all came to a crashing. Let's say it all almost ended for McLaren on one lap when they both went off, and as Nav mentioned, Lando damaged his floor, but Oscar nearly retired. And the amazing thing was that McLaren responded to that and pitted Lando immediately. And it was in the aftermath of that Red Bull didn't pit Max quick enough, which gave Lando the breathing space he needed to come back out in front after everybody had come in and pitted for inters. So yeah, I mean, I think Red Bull have the best driver who's able to maximize his car, but McLaren looked like almost like a better team from a technical standpoint, and the strategy is also improving. So they're able to cover up for their drivers. I don't want to say incompetence, but their drivers' mistakes. So I found that interesting. It's a little bit of a different dynamic for sure. So but there was a lot going on down the field.
Ace, what were your thoughts on McLaren?
That they look like they have the best car out there. It's clear that in conditions in Australia, both on Saturday and Sunday, were hard. They were difficult. I thought that every driver was very on the limit. They were making mistakes, and those mistakes were getting punished. Alonso damaged his floor, Antonelli damaged his floor, Berman crashed twice. Well, the first time he just simply spun out in the gravel. And then in the race, also Norris and Piastri going off, and several other drivers, rookie making mistakes, Sainz having a spike, a torque spike, and sending out. So I thought that the Australian track, even in the dry, not just the wet, was very difficult with all the gravel, especially at turn 6. that it was punishing the drivers a lot. And so I think that is good news, because it certainly makes you appreciate more the job the driver is doing. And exactly on this aspect, I don't feel like Norris and McLaren were throwing the win away. I truly thought the conditions were difficult, and they still won thanks to a car advantage, yes, but they still won even under these difficult conditions where any mistakes was getting punished heavily. So I actually respect a lot the win. I don't think it was a foregone conclusion that McLaren would have won.
I mean, that crash was interesting. Or, well, not really crash. The offs they had was interesting because you can see Max behind them and he just takes the corner perfectly. And maybe he had enough time to react, or just because of the weather, he knew, okay, it's going to be tricky. But with Oscar, when he came off the grass, back onto the track and then off again, I looked and I was thinking, if he just kept in a straight line once he got on the gravel, once he got on the track, it wouldn't have spun again and maybe attempted to brake in a straight line. But instead, he ended up spinning in a way that meant he drifted so slowly that he was very close to beaching the car by the end of that. But they, by that we knew it was going to pour it down, and that was they were the first to get there because they were at the front. But Oscar himself, he was really hounding Lando before that, and his race pace and his recovery, he gained a lot of positions after the restart, and his pace was better, and he obviously wanted to win this. And it's just like, without that, he might just have done it.
Yeah, he might have, but he was always playing catch up, wasn't he? From the beginning of the race, he got passed by Max, and then after that, I just felt that he had the speed, and he could have definitely fought for the win. But he's not exactly a driver that has an incredible amount of aggression that you feel like he's going to fight tooth and nail with Lando wheel to wheel sometimes. And then he does make the occasional mistake. So, frankly speaking, as the season goes on, he's going to have less excuses now. So he definitely should have done better today. And the positive is that, yes, the car has speed. So he'll have plenty of opportunities to make up for this. But he was always on the back foot in a way from his bad start, which he did make up for. But he needs to start getting. Basically, he needs to start out qualifying Lando, and he needs to stop being behind him in the races, so he can manage the pace better and he can have a bit more confidence. In terms of just being able to dictate his own race. So I was not impressed by Piastri at all this weekend, especially in the race. But I respect what Ace said. I think it was a good win. I just think that car is so good, and perhaps I'm a little bit more sympathetic about his pace, Lando's pace after he went off and damaged his floor, given what information Nav provided. But as Peter said, Max didn't go off in that corner, and we know that the Red Bull has some tire warm-up issues and it generally doesn't manage the tires as well as the McLaren does. So for both of them to go off at the same corner and then one of them to effectively take himself out of the race, it's a bit unacceptable. No way I would put either McLaren as the top driver in this race. And if Max Verstappen was in that McLaren, I doubt he would have made that mistake. So
If
okay,
I may add,
yeah, that's what
I may add one other thing about McLaren, which really hit me, because after Saturday, after qualifying, Andrea Stella commented, "We're kind of surprised because we didn't expect this to be a favorable track for us." And that was after putting half a second on everybody else. So that is very menacing comment.
I think that was mind games. Honestly, I have no proof of that, but I can't imagine that's true. I mean, that would be horrific if that's true, because that means they're going to dominate for sure. But yeah, I like to think Andrea was playing a little bit of mind games there, but you may be right. That could just spell disaster for the other teams as the season progresses.
It's interesting you said you were not that impressed with Piastri. I did think his Saturday was better, but the other issue is that it was in Australia. So in theory, you might think that Piastri will be a bit faster in his home race, and there was still. So he qualified within a 10th, but you would expect it to be one of the better tracks for Piastri. So that might be an issue in the future if he cannot out-qualify Lando. And the second thing is, Yeah, just about Lando, it must be said that he didn't bottle it. He didn't properly bottle it well. The floor was damaged, and it could have led to a bottling, but it didn't happen at the end of the day. So he won a race that I think that last year or maybe previously he could have lost with a damaged floor. He still managed it well at the start when Max was right behind, and then in the final lap or two when Max was again just half a second behind, he managed it well. So some credit has to go there. He might genuinely be on course to a championship, and that's something we have to kind of accept now, I think.
Yeah, I think as well with I think as well with Piastri. I mean, this could be like a make or break season for him because he could become the next Webber or the next Button or, God forbid, the next Sato. Because if we are to assume that in normal conditions this battle is going to be between him and Lando, he's already 23 points down from just one single mistake that was only marginally worse than what Lando did at the same time, and that's made a huge amount of difference. So he's got some catching up to do already, but that will be it'll be interesting to see how it unfolds. I mean, it's kind of depressing that we've got it's another season where one team is going to be miles ahead, but I guess it's not Red Bull or Mercedes, so that creates a bit of novelty. But speaking of those two, I think we'll move on to Red Bull themselves. So Max, we've already talked a fair bit about that. Other than that little off he had where he fell behind Piastri, he drove extremely well, as you would have expected of him, especially in these conditions. But then when it comes to Liam Lawson, that the entire weekend was just absolutely abysmal from him.
Oh yeah, that was absolutely unacceptable. And I understand Liam is new to the team and he's figuring out the car, but there's a limit. Okay, first of all, Liam is not a true rookie. He has had lots of race experience now. Does anyone know the exact number of races he's done, just off the top of their head here? I'm not sure how many.
13.
11 or 12, roughly that much. Across
Yeah.
3 seasons, he's not a rookie. They keep calling him a rookie.
Yeah, a dozen.
Yeah, in the race, they had a classification for the rookies, and he was listed where it was 4 DNFs and then 1 lap down 10 seconds, and it's like, he's not a
But
rookie.
even they don't really know, because in the rookie, we had the round table thing. They didn't have him, so they're not really sure where to put him. I wouldn't put him as a rookie.
Yeah, absolutely. And 12 races is a lot of experience. And yes, the car is different. I get it, but my goodness, he was just making mistakes just nonstop throughout the weekend, and he just looked like he had no confidence, no initiative. Okay, yeah, he started from the pit lane, and that's always tough, but he had no speed on the inter tire. I mean, look at his split times compared to Max. It was like shockingly off the pace, and he had some serious issues. Yeah, go ahead.
Karen, forget the inter tire. I had seen his first stint. There was a graph of all the timings from the different stints. He was 2 or 3 seconds behind Max on the first stint. That was basically on the dry stint, he was 2 or 3 seconds behind Max. So he was all over the place for the entire weekend. Just adding on to your issue about
yeah, totally. I totally agree with that, and I think he had a few laps on the slicks where it was decent, and then it rained again, and he looked hopeless after that. And okay, I admit they tried to stay out on the medium tire. They were hoping the track would dry, or would stay dry, but that was not a gamble that really worked out. And I think he backed out of pushing because it was so wet at that point as well. When he stayed out on the medium. So that probably made him look a bit worse. But overall, cannot be penultimate in the penultimate position, second last, when your teammate was fighting for the win in a Grand Prix. That's just unacceptable. It doesn't matter how much inexperience you have, how in tune with the car Max is. Cannot do that. And we've seen teams basically be merciless when the gap is that big, right? If Max is fighting for the win, you need to be in the top 10 at a bare minimum, mate. So Liam's got to bounce back from this quickly. Not sure if anyone else has something to add.
Forget top 10, just top 12, top 13. Honestly, if he qualified 12, I would have been fine with it. It's just what was it, 17th or 18th? That was diabolical, and he made mistakes, and that car seems like a handful to drive if you're not Max. If you saw his onboard, the onboard of his quali lap, the car just seemed to not be hitting any apexes. So it's obviously a hard car to drive, and we'll get onto it when we talk about the racing bulls. I'm not sure that Yuki would have done much better. I think Yuki would have done a bit better just out of experience, but people thinking that Yuki would have qualified, what, seventh in it? No, there's no chance. Anyone in that car would struggle. Actually, I will say, you put any other driver in that car, I'm not sure anyone else gets into Q3, and that includes Lando, Lewis, Alonso, Charles. If you put any other driver in their first race there, they will struggle. It's a really weird car, but Liam has to get a grip because everyone's on his tail already. There's already talks of him getting demoted or, God forbid, sacked. Lindblad is being considered for a super license already by Red Bull. I mean, earlier this week, Red Bull said that they were looking for an exemption for Lindblad, who's only 17, to get a super license, which kind of implies they're considering him in that racing bull at some point. So yeah, Lawson has to literally and figuratively get a grip very soon.
Agreed. And look, we saw that the Red Bull car is difficult to drive, certainly with Max, and it certainly doesn't have the same tire characteristics as well. The tires were overheating. There was a lot of degradation relative to the McLaren. And on the intermediates, it was even worse, I thought. I thought that their problems were exacerbated on that tire compared to the slick tire. So, yeah, Liam's got it cut out for him, that's for sure. But Max showed why he's probably the best driver in Formula One. Absolutely outperformed his car, given all the problems that I just laid out. He even passed the McLaren at the start. It's only because his intermediate tires didn't last. And then when the late rain did arrive, he stayed out. But the dry tires just couldn't handle those interconditions. So when he pitted,
Well,
he
let's
came back
let's talk
out.
about that actually. Do you think that was the
Yeah.
right decision at the time? Because I think it was. It was a good gamble to take given the circumstances.
Okay, I think they should have pitted a lap earlier, like McLaren did. But like I can't remember. Did he stay out 2 laps after Norris pitted, or did he pit 1 lap after? Does anybody know off the top of their head?
At
I
least
think
two, right?
I think it was
so. I
two.
think so. He
But
should have only done 1 more lap, in my opinion. Anyways,
But even the thing is, everyone, the warnings they were all getting beforehand, they were all saying it's going to be really heavy rain, and it's like you can see the clouds in front of you, and with the way it was in the final set, it's like it's obviously going to spread and get worse. So just pit sooner. Like it's there seems to be there's often a lot of teams and drivers, and we saw this particularly with the Dutch Grand Prix 2 years ago. A general lack of foresight on wet conditions and changing about maybe just react quickly because things can when it's heavy rain it can develop very fast.
absolutely. So I just think that Red Bull didn't react quickly enough, and McLaren actually did react when they needed to. They salvaged the result. It was a good team win, even if the driver performance wasn't quite up to the level for McLaren. But
But
with
do you
Red
not think
Bull,
it was more of a calculated risk? It was more of a calculated risk from Red Bull.
it was, but I mean, it ended up being the wrong decision, I think, at the end of the day. I mean, maybe it was, but there's no doubt. I think if you look at, if they could redo that segment, I think they would have pitted Max earlier, rather than keep him out for that late. Keep him out for that extra few laps, where his dry tires just couldn't handle the interconditions. So he started to lose time by the end of his, by the time he had to come back into the pits, and that gave Norris that breathing room to make up the gap that he had somewhat lost before he pitted. It's this race was winnable for Red Bull because of the mistake McLaren made. I really believe that. Given how incredibly well Max was driving, and the fact that McLaren's drivers made a key mistake in the race, if Red Bull had timed their pit stop perfectly, which they didn't, Max might have been able to pull off the win. You've got to say that. Look at the finishing margin. Are we saying that time couldn't have been found with a better time pit stop? I think it could have been found.
Yeah, I mean, if Max
that's-
follows Lando into the pits, it's as simple as that. If Max follows Lando, then maybe he beats him in the pit lane, or he just passes him a few seconds after. Because I think in
Yeah.
similar conditions, if he's not chasing him, basically, then Max would have had the edge if they were at the same time in the pits and they had come out together. And yeah, Lawson just not good enough. So yeah, we're both drivers. Very, very different weekends for them.
But then the third team, of course, a bit of a surprise result for them in the end was Mercedes. George we saw relatively little of him in the race. He just kind of kept it on the straight and narrow and did his job, and it paid off with Piastri spinning off. He got third. And then Antonelli, goodness, I mean, yeah, pretty bad qualifying to go out in Q1, but then he gained 11 places in the race and was making lots of overtakes and was right behind Alonso when he crashed out as well.
12 because Albon, his Antonelli's
12,
penalty
of course.
got cancelled.
The penalty got reversed. But yeah, I think maybe, as it's Antonelli, maybe we should leave this one to Ace.
So Antonelli had a very rookie first race. He clearly made a mistake in quali. He damaged the floor, so he couldn't go through to Q2. And you could see actually the damage on the floor because when he was shown on TV, you could see under the car the T-tray ahead of the floor. It was glowing bright. And so the commentators were saying, is that a laser or something? It wasn't. It was just the floor, which was sticking too close to the ground and touching too much. That was due to the damage. And so he was starting 16th. He made a good start. He gained places. I think so. He gained 1 place from Sainz, 1 place from Hajar. He gained another place from from Duan incident. He was overtaken by Hülkenberg, but he overtook Bortoleto, and so he was still in 13th. And then, as the race progressed, he was basically the only driver who was making overtakes in these conditions. So he first overtook Hülkenberg, then spun out, had to overtake Hülkenberg again. Then a few laps later, he finally caught Stroll, and he barely caught the DRS out of turn 6. And after the 2 straights with the DRS on, he made the overtake. So half a lap and he got rid of Stroll. And then he got stuck behind Alonso when he reached him. But then Alonso spun out, and so race was reset. He was now stuck behind Gasly, and then there was the case, the weather mess, and he was among the drivers who pitted at the first occasion possible. And because he had to stuck behind George, he lost the place from Stroll, so he had to overtake Stroll again, and he did. And then gain a whole lot of other places from all the other drivers who hadn't pitted immediately. And so at the final restart, he was 5th and finally managed to overtake Albon. And I understand that all these overtakes are from a Mercedes, which is a top car and was the third fastest car of today, against the midfielders or even backmarkers in the case of the Sauber. But so first of all, he was the only driver who was making overtakes, and Hamilton, who is very good at racecraft in the wet weather, he wasn't overtaking Albon. He was stuck behind him for 40 laps. How many laps was Antonelli stuck behind Albon? I think 5. So yeah, I think he did. He showed that his wet weather talent is real. He managed to carry that over from the junior categories. And now he has to show that he also carries over everything else, because clearly he had far too unclean a weekend. He was constantly off Russell's pace in qualifying, then he made amazing qualifying, and we still have doubts on his actual race pace in the dry. So still, he has a lot to show. For now, he was the best rookie of today, so it's a passing mark in my opinion.
Yeah, all
Yeah.
it took really today to be one of the best rookies was not to crash, and Antonelli decided not to crash and make up more than 10 positions, and also become the second youngest point scorer in Formula One history. And when you look at who's in first, then that can only be a good sign for him. So very impressed with Antonelli. I think the Q1 exit was also quite unexpected and unfair. So at the end, it's the Sunday drive that matters, and he really delivered.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think that his passes were good. He passed so many drivers, as you both alluded to. I think that the Mercedes drivers also look like they're hooked up with their car. I mean, George looked very good, happy with his car, and Antonelli actually looked like he could push. We're going to talk about this in a second when we transition to the other teams, but Hamilton didn't look confident in his car. I think that also contributed to it. Yes, Antonelli has substantial talent in the wet, as has been mentioned, but he also looked like he had a very compliant car. He was really pushing, wasn't he? He was going right up to the white lines, against the barrier, aggressive on the curbs. Hardly the same with the two Ferrari drivers who looked a bit hesitant in the car, especially Lewis. So yeah, Antonelli, tremendous job, great bounce back drive, but as Ace said, he still has to show more in terms of being a complete package. And then with George, I think George did a great job. He was so consistent. But then you got to think about this. I think that car is very well is probably the third best car on the grid after the Red Bull and Ferrari. Yet he was quite substantially
And
behind
McLaren.
Max. I'm sorry. I meant to say. I misspoke there, Nav. I meant to say McLaren and Ferrari. I don't think Red Bull is better than Mercedes. It could be level. I don't think they're better. I just think that George couldn't match Max, but he was still very good overall. So he did a great job, and you could see the pace was enough for them to fight for the podium. And you know, he just basically his race was very solid, consistent, and barely any mistakes. There was a few moments when the rain was heavier when he was on worn intermediates, and then when the rain arrived when they were on slicks. But I mean, I don't know. Did you guys see George really like make a big mistake in this race? He was just very consistent, error free. But I still wonder, you know, did he get the most out of his car? I mean, he probably did. But I do think that, I still think Max did a better job in terms of driver of the day than George did, because Max is in a car that's either equal or worse from the data we've seen. And he was far ahead of George for a lot of the race. So great race for Mercedes anyways, and a good starting point.
Yeah, I think Mercedes will be very happy with where they are because it didn't look too good after the testing. Well, testing doesn't mean much, but they didn't seem too confident. And I think George is going to be in this position a lot this season where he will be in fourth, kind of in no man's land. And he will grab a few podiums if one of the top three cars gets into trouble. So this should be happening quite a lot. In case, unless Ferrari does not bridge the gap, George will find himself completely alone in fourth or third in a lot of races, which is good. It's good to be anonymous in that way sometimes. But George himself, there doesn't seem to be much competition looming for him in that situation.
I really hope he can ignite that rivalry he had with Max at the end of the season. So let's hope that also comes to the fore.
Can I add one last thing? It is clear that the Mercedes is a very drivable car. It appears that the team was able, and the drivers were able to immediately get to understand it and to push it, and neither had any glaring obvious big mistake when driving it, but except both of them spun out in the same point. Russell on Friday, Antonelli in the race, but that was because they touched the grass. But otherwise, the car is clearly easy to drive. It is easy to push, and I think that is the reason behind this strong result of today, this third and fourth place. At the start of the race, we saw Jack Doohan crashing, and a few team radios later, we hear that the engineers telling their drivers to look out for the white lines because that's where they believe Jack Doohan was caught out and spun. And Antonelli answered, "Oh yeah, I found it out because I almost did the same thing as Doohan." And so I think, yes, Antonelli was a rookie. He made the same thing that Doohan did, but because the car is better, he wasn't punished in the same way as Jack was punished for for the same mistake, and so he was able to learn and to carry on. Maybe the reason so many of these rookie drivers today struggled was simply because the car they had was hard to drive, and so any mistake was very heavily punished. Instead, the Mercedes is an easy car to drive, and so the driver makes a mistake, and they get to live on and learn from it. So that may be another reason behind the strong result we will see in the following weeks.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's interesting because the when he was saying about, oh, I almost did the same thing about the white lines. It kind of reminds me of Senna, British F3, that anecdote that Martin Brundle's always giving about how he just seemed to instinctively know, like he took different lines every single lap through cops or whatever, because he was like, well, I knew that there wasn't going to be grip there, and it was like, how did you know that? And it has elements of there. He's clearly a bit of a wet weather specialist.
Yeah.
Well
said.
let's move on from a team that was very good at reading the conditions and very drivable to a team that wasn't at all. And it's not Ferrari. I just want to mention a team that actually outqualified the Ferrari, and it's Racing Bulls, because I genuinely think that Tsunoda could have made the podium if they had made the right call. But that's the thing with Toro Rosso / AlphaTauri / Racing Bulls. They are absolutely woeful at strategy, especially in changing conditions. Everyone talks about Ferrari because they're the big team, but Racing Bulls, they're so bad at it. So Yuki was the first one to pit because they actually predicted, they actually made a saying that they should just pit if they know the rain is coming in. Racing Bulls was one of the teams that did that, but they put Yuki on dries, and you're just there wondering, why would you do that? Why would that ever make sense? If they had just made the right call, it would have been P3, P4. Which, when I say right call, if they had just pitted like everyone had, it would have been P4 for them. And if they had put those inters early on before anyone else, that would have been a podium, and he would have led the race for a bit. So, yeah, it's just not good for them. And Hadjar, I'm not sure what to think of it. Is it unlucky? Is it lack of skill? But it was sad, that's for sure.
I mean, yeah, Tsunoda was driving extremely well until they messed up the pit stops, because he passed Leclerc after Alonso's safety car, was up to P5, and even with his qualifying and the way things are going for Lawson, I was like, this feels like him making a big statement about, you know, what you could have had there, and maybe they're thinking that, I don't know, but yeah, it all went wrong to just drop down that much. And Hadjar, I mean, it's not people crashing behind in the formation lap. It almost never happens, and so it's. I mean, Leclerc did a couple of years ago, but that was a mechanical issue. We've had people crash on the way to the grid before, certainly, but formation lap accidents really, really do not happen very often. And it was literally not even the second corner. It was after one corner and he spins. Like, yeah, I don't know what to say.
Yeah. I think the only thing you can say is that, you know, he can't be making mistakes like that again, even if he's a rookie. It's unacceptable, but it is his first race ever. So if there were ever a scenario he gets some slack, maybe it's this one, because the conditions were poor. It's his first race, but it's embarrassing. And, you know, if Isaac Hadjar wants to have a Formula One career, that's probably the last time he can ever do something like that, frankly. At least this season. He can't do it again. Yeah,
I mean, Helmut Marko, someone's made the mistake of putting a microphone in front of his mouth. He's made some interesting comments, apparently. So about Hadjar, he said, Isaac Hadjar did a little bit of crying show after his crash. That was very embarrassing. And then on Yuki, he said, Yuki is not the typical Japanese like Iwasa, who bows 5 times and apologizes for wanting to say something. Tsunoda says what he thinks, and Hadjar has a southern temperament. So we're beginning the season with a nice healthy dose of racism from
So he has started the year by attacking his rookie driver who made a mistake, and then somehow making a comment on like 3 different ethnicities at the same time.
Yeah. Listen, I have my own personal issues with Helmut Marko. I think he's disrespectful. I think he's incredibly rude, beyond any kind of characterization of someone's background. And let's not forget, lads. Let's not forget the big mistake this clown made. He thought that Enrique Bernoldi would be a better choice for Sauber than you know who. And at the end of the day, you can never recover from a mistake like that. Helmet is. I think he's got a lot of insecurities too. I don't want to turn this into a psychology session, but it's just odd how he finds a way to kind of poke at drivers when there's just no need to. You know, Hajar's accident, yeah, he cried, and maybe crying isn't what a team wants to see, but he's a kid. He's emotional. It's his first race. It's nothing to insult him about. And with Sonoda, I mean, maybe he doesn't like Sonoda's character, and I actually understand that. I find Sonoda to be a bit abrasive myself, to say the least. But Sonoda did an amazing job, as you guys both mentioned this weekend. Like, this was not the weekend to be putting your driver down in any way. The guy drove the wheels off the car, and it was because of a strategy mistake. He didn't get points. Nav, what do you think about that?
Well, firstly, thanks for taking the checklist on when we were going to mention Kimi in this race. It's
Yeah.
quite late, so good with this one.
Yeah.
And the
Nice.
second thing is that, yeah, Bernoldi,
You're
it's
welcome.
interesting because it's interesting on Bernoldi very quickly, because if things had gone differently, Red Bull could have taken over either Sauber or Arrows just because of Bernoldi instead of Jordan, and everything could have been different because Jordan had a better starting point than bloody Arrows or even Sauber, who were operating very cheaply at the time. But going back to the race, yeah, Isaac Pacho, he was seen crying in the arms of not crying, well, he was seen hugging Anthony Hamilton, and it has been praised online because Anthony Hamilton, to be fair, he took it upon himself, not for the cameras. He is someone who has always cared about rookies since his son joined the sport, and he went to see Hadjar to say, look, it's okay. Grades have made mistakes like this, and it was nice to see. But I'm guessing that Marco did not enjoy that. That might have fostered some of his comments to see, the Hamilton clan going to comfort Hadjar and not the Red Bull clan at all. And we know how Marco cares about those little things.
You know what bothers me, guys, is this. This is what bothers me about Helmet.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm just saying that Helmet tends to be really protective of drivers he likes. I can remember Vettel would cause crashes at Red Bull, and Peter, Nav, and Ace, feel free to correct me on this. But it just seemed like with Vettel, he was always so nurturing and always favoring Vettel. And even if Vettel did something incredibly stupid, which wasn't often, but sometimes, Vettel is a world-class driver, obviously. He would nurture Seb and be like, "Oh, Seb is one of us," kind of feel to it. Before you answer that, I just want to add one last thing on this team. I think they're the sixth quickest team, and I think it's really close between them, Alpine, and Aston. So that'll be a good midfield battle, and something to look forward to. I'll stop there.
You think it's really close, but Yuki put it on P5.
He just did a really good lap, to be honest. But you may be right on that. Maybe his car is faster. What do you think, Nav? Then, so what are you saying?
I'd say VCOB is a bit above the rest of the teams you mentioned right now, because you need to consider Yuki was P5 and Hadjar was P11. When Hadjar, he's a decent driver, but he's not exactly a generational driver. So if you put those two times together and you put the fact that Alpine were 10th and 15th or 14th or whatever, 17th, and Aston were 12th and 13th, even though Aston had a broken claw, I'd put VCOB higher up, and it will be interesting to see Yuki do well, because however fickle fans might be, it will be fun to see Yuki outqualify Lawson in every single race.
If I can go back to the Helmut Marko points, I think what not many understand is that Marko is the entrepreneur type of guy, imprenditore in inglese.
Intrepid,
Emperor?
predatory, like
Imperator is like a dictator. Is that what you're saying?
Right, dictatorial. Okay.
Yeah. I get the term capitalist. So the guys who own the factories, who invested their capital, entrepreneurs in English.
Oh, entrepreneur.
Yes,
You mean?
entrepreneur.
Oh, okay,
Thank you.
yeah.
So Helmut is this kind of very long-seeing guy the guy who can make 100 different investments, and then half of the time they're gonna utterly fail. The other 4 out of 10 times they're gonna be semi-flops. But the one time his vision actually works out, he's gonna gain a lot. And I think he is this kind of guy with the choice of drivers. So he's gonna be half of the time utterly wrong in his choices. 4 out of 10 times he's gonna pick a okay driver, but nothing incredible. And then there is the one time where he absolutely finds a hidden gem, the generational talent. And these kinds of guys don't live off the half of the times they are utterly wrong. They live off this 1 out of 10 times where they're incredibly right. Because whatever they lose in investing in the other 9 drivers, they're gonna make 100 times more out of the one guy they get right. And so this is how I feel Helmut Marko treats his drivers. They're kind of like investments. And he tries, he puts them, he gives them the chance. And if they start to give back from the investment, then good enough. If they aren't giving back the investment he put in, then he just simply cuts them off and tries again. Because the one time he actually gets it right with Max Verstappen, with Sebastian Vettel, he's gonna win so much. It will be laughable, the losses he had to endure to get to the point.
So the team which is probably fourth fastest but did not finish fourth fastest on track is Ferrari. So that was interesting because for both of them, not an ideal weekend. Hamilton, understandably, is still learning the ropes of being here. The wet conditions didn't seem to really work well. Leclerc had a good start, but then he had that very big spin later on, and then they made that call. The strategy, I don't know what it was. The commentators obsessing over Hamilton were like, "Oh, this is amazing." It's like they're going to have to pit. There's no possible way they can stay out, even on a safety car with hard tires like that. And so that just kind of wrecked it, and they come out 8th and 10th. But it seems like they do have a bit of work to do if they want to catch up to the front guys.
I have no idea what happened to Ferrari today. So even already yesterday in qualifying, after the disappointment, Leclerc went to the microphones and said, "Yes, we know we had to make some changes because we were forced to." And then he never commented on this ever again. So no one knows what Ferrari was forced to change. Probably it was a ride height issue. Probably the floor was getting too much wear, and so they had to raise the car, and so they lost performance. But nevertheless, it wasn't a wet weather setup that Ferrari was using in qualifying. They literally sucked today. And they were clearly, you get the doubt that Ferrari today wasn't even the slowest of the top teams. It was simply as fast as any other midfield car, because Leclerc wasn't pulling a gap from Tsunoda. Hamilton was unable to overtake Albon, so you get this reasonable doubt that maybe Ferrari wasn't even better than Racing Bulls or Williams today.
Okay. I think it's the second quickest car. I think the data shows that they had incredible pace on Friday in qualifying and race trim. And I think Vastor said the same thing after the race, that this position does not reflect how fast that car is. In terms of their inability to make up positions, I think both drivers are not fully comfortable with the car. It's telling. Leclerc lost a few positions after his spin, and then the team stopped too late to switch to the inters, so they kept losing positions. But at least Leclerc had some confidence to make some moves, like the one on his teammate, for example. With Lewis, he said it in the race. He had no confidence in the car. Absolutely. Struggled with the balance. He had communication issues with his race engineer. He kept saying, "Leave me to it," and his engineer kept not leaving him to it. Don't know what that was all about. And Ferrari had their usual, subpar strategy that we all like to make fun of. So I think if they can put the strategy together and they can find a better balance for both drivers, you will see this team catapult to second quickest in any condition. I really believe that. But this was a horrific team effort more than anything today. Leclerc made a mistake as well, but the team really dropped the ball with strategy. So they just have to, I'm putting my chips on Ferrari, hoping that they are the ones that could find a way to counter McLaren's dominance because I think they have the second best car. But we'll have to see. It's never a given with Ferrari.
Yeah, so two things. Firstly, the radio messages, those are making the headlines on social media right now. You really need to stop wondering if it's on purpose because that engineer replying to Leclerc saying, "My seat is full of water" by "must be the water," very seriously, that's not what you would want at Ferrari. And then, secondly, that that situation where an engineer is not listening to the driver, as in Lewis's case, that really got Lewis, I think, flustered and tired during the actual wet spells, because you want good communication with your engineer when it's raining. You want good communication with the team. The last thing you want is someone telling you what to do when that's when the driver can manage and understand the most. And finally, I feel like when they put those hearts on and they stayed out, it might have been thinking that there might be a red flag. At least that's what I thought when I saw it. Because if there's a red flag, then they're geniuses. They stop the race, rolling start, or God forbid the race doesn't even start again. And they're in a situation where they're in a 1-2 and they can change their tires. So I don't know if that was the tactic, but I'm willing to give them the benefit of the doubt. And maybe they were just expecting it to be a red flag.
Yeah, it's hard to give them the benefit of the doubt after so many years, but yeah, you got to say that they really did not call that correctly at all. So the other thing I would say is that Charles Leclerc always makes a mistake in intermediate conditions. So I'm just gonna put that out there.
Yeah.
You know, it's unacceptable. Like this is his. I don't know how many years he's been in F1 now. Um, 7.
So, eighth season, and yet wet weather is one of his major blind spots.
I really think so too. I'm not just saying that. You know what I mean, Peter? It's been a recurring issue for him. It's just not good enough. He needs to step that up.
Yeah. But there's a lot going on there, and that's one of the most interesting teams to look at. But I guess it was just for every team. It's surprising because even though this is a circuit that almost every driver knows and it's quite easy to learn, there was just a lot of uncertainty, not helped by the conditions. But that seemed to be definitely the case with Ferrari. A surprise performer in this was Williams, because there were musings in testing and beforehand, particularly with the addition of Sainz, that would improve their fortunes, and that does seem to have been the case, ironically enough, of how the race went for him. Because Albon was qualified well, he lost that position right at the end to Antonelli, but otherwise was driving really well, and Sainz, he just crashes behind the safety car with a massive torque spike, and I don't know what that was. It was very strange.
Yeah. So I think Sainz mentioned it had something to do with upshifting when in safety car mode. So there's obviously some kind of a car characteristic in that setting that differs from the cars he's driven in the past. I'm not sure that justifies making that mistake, but it looks like they have a good handle on what the issue was, and that's always a good thing. It means you can address the issue, whether it's changing the way the car upshifts or whatever it may be. I believe that Sainz and Albon are a huge upgrade from the drivers that Williams have had in recent years as a pairing. And separate to Sainz's mistake, Albon made a really good call to pit for the inter tires when the weather conditions worsened, and that kind of sent him up to fourth. And he even finished ahead of Antonelli officially before Antonelli's penalty was reversed, and which put him back in front of Albon by the end of the race. But kudos to Albon. He did an amazing job all weekend qualifying in the race, and to the Williams strategists. They got it right. So they called everything correctly, and it's just basically put them in a really strong position now at the beginning of the season. And once Carlos gets up to speed, this is a team that's going to be surprising a lot of people every weekend, I think. So they've got 2 great drivers now compared to what they have in prior seasons. I think Sainz is still going to be the driver by the end of the season that is the number 1, but Albon showing that he has some talent. So really interesting for the rest of the season. So yeah, a great job at Williams.
Yeah, more than two good drivers, it's two good development drivers, which is exactly what they needed at Williams right now. And they are both credited and lauded a lot for that. So it was clear that whoever would get Sainz in the midfield was going to get kind of the perfect driver to spur their comeback, and Williams got him. So it's fantastic for them, and it's being said that Sainz was the one to help out Albon with the strategy goals. No idea if that's PR or if that was genuine, but just the fact that it is even a question means that everyone respects Sainz for being someone who may have made that goal. So it's really good news for Williams. They are already fast, and I think they're only gonna get faster. And let's see. I think we'll see both of those cars in Q3 quite a few times this year.
Yeah, I think this could be a very good. I think they could certainly be better than the rest. It could be a very good midfield season for them, the likes of which we haven't seen in quite a long time, I think. So next team would be, God forbid, Aston Martin. That was, well, first half there was nothing to say. I mean, Lance, I don't think I saw him once in the race, and yet he manages to get P6. Alonso was being very kind of catty during the weekend. He's like, well, if I did learn anything in practice, I'm not going to tell you about it. Maybe he's just fed up of having done, 1,500 interviews by now across all the races he's done. But then he crashed on the straight with Antonelli right behind him, and that's the first time he's crashed out of a race on his own in over 15 years, I think. Like Spa 2010 apparently is the last time. There might be more recent than that, but yeah, that was quite rare from him.
Well, they will not have included sprint races because
but then
2023 Spa, he
yes,
on his own for sure.
He loses the will to live during sprint races though. So
yeah, that's true. But yeah, it was a weird weekend for Aston Martin. They were faster than they thought, definitely, and that's a good sign. A lot of people thought they would be 9th or 10th, and they're at least 7th in that mix. Alonso thought he could have made it to Q3, but he made a mistake in quali, damaged his floor, and qualified 12th. And in the race, for example, he was the only driver to properly give Antonelli a challenge. Antonelli was stuck behind Alonso until Alonso crashed. So that shows that there was some pace there, and Alonso was catching up to Gasly. And when you see how the race unraveled, even though he did cause a safety car, it could have been top 5 for him. It really could have. At least top 6, maybe not top 5. But it could have been a very solid double points for Aston Martin. And that crash, again, yes, it was his fault, but if you look at the pics, there was so much gravel on the track from Piastri and Gasly who had just gone by, because Piastri had completely gone off through lots of gravel on the track. Then Gasly just about survived and also threw gravel on the track because he had to cut the corner a little bit, and then Alonso that's why he just lost it in the way he did. It was weird on board, and now we kind of know what happened. So better than we thought for Aston Martin. And Stroll, a bit like Russell, he had a good invisible race. Sometimes in those wet races, you want to be invisible because that means you're not making any mistakes. And Stroll did exactly that. Completely stayed out of danger, did his thing, finished 6th. And it might be his highest points finish of the year for all we know.
I completely disagree. I don't think Alonso would have finished top 5, not even top 6, for a very simple reason, is that he really doesn't give a flying care about these placements. So we saw it at Silverstone last year already, but also several times, even this very own race. So he was basically, aside from Antonelli, but I already explained, Antonelli was overtaking cars who were slower than his own, but he was making overtakes. The only other drivers who could challenge the cars ahead in any way today were Max Verstappen at the beginning when he was very close to Lando Norris before he made a mistake and Piastri went through and then the McLaren just blew away. And then again at the end when Verstappen was tailing Norris, who probably had some damage. The other drivers was Hamilton, who was stuck behind Albon, and we don't know if today the Ferrari was equally fast as the Williams, or if it was a top car and was just stuck. We don't know. But anyway, Hamilton was attacking Albon. And the only other driver was Alonso, who it is apparent that the Alpine and the Aston and the Racing Bull and the Williams are close together in performance. We don't know the ranking. We will find out eventually. But these 4 cars in performance are very close to each other. And Alonso was very hard, challenging hard Gasly ahead. And so basically, Alonso, for the 30 laps he was in the race, kept staying away from Gasly in clean air, 2-3 seconds behind. Then when he decided he had saved up enough tire, enough resources, enough energy or whatever, he began to close in on Gasly. Then he got the DRS on the back straights. And from there on, he started, once he got the DRS, he then put on the challenge. And it was always the same following steps. A very calm exit
He did
out of
that
the
4
last
times,
turn.
I think.
Yes,
Yeah, he did that
a
4
very
times.
slow exit, calm exit out of the last turn. Then into turn 1, very heartbreaking, and then an incredibly fast turn 2. I don't know why, but Alonso all weekend long was extremely strong in turn 2. Don't ask why, I don't know. He was only strong in turn 2. Don't even know why. Anyway, a very strong turn 2, which sling him in the second straight towards Gasly. Let's say he, into turn 3 was 0.6 seconds behind Gasly. Then very steady turn 3, 4, 5. He loses ground from Gasly. He goes back to 1 second before making an insanely aggressive turn 6 approach, which slings him from 1 second behind into turn 6 to 0.6 seconds behind Gasly out of turn 6. So I let you imagine just how incredibly risky and hard he was taking turn 6. And for 3 times this walked, he got a massive slingshot out of the DRS zone of turn 7 and turn 8. And he came very close to Gasly all 3 times into turn 9, but never enough to make the overtake. And then in the next 2 turns, he couldn't follow, so the overtake attempts ended there all 3 times. The 4th time he tried this approach, Gasly went slightly off into turn 6, brought gravel onto the track, and because Alonso was so aggressive into turn 6, the gravel was enough to spin him out into the wall. I bet that if it were any other lap where Alonso wasn't pushing as much, even if he found the gravel, he wouldn't have crashed. Just like nobody was crashing there in turn 6, because nobody else was taking turn 6 as aggressively as he was. So why was he trying so hard to overtake Gasly? Why didn't he just sit there behind, wait for things to happen, and eventually was gonna get a result, like Hülkenberg got, like George Russell got, like Lance Stroll got. Lance Stroll didn't do very much this race. He didn't push, he wasn't very fast. He just kept his own pace. He just kept away from anybody. He pitted at the right times, and he ended up 6th place. A very good result, but Anonymous also. Just like Anonymous was Hülkenberg, and just like Anonymous was Russell, if he were not on the podium, that is. Anyway, instead, Alonso has this tendency that he doesn't like displacements. For him, finishing P6, who cares? P5? I mean, if I could be better, why not? And so he was trying so hard to overtake Gasly because he just wanted to finish as far ahead as possible. And I don't mean just P6, P5. He wanted a podium. He wanted something. And that is why when you now say if Alonso didn't crash, he would have finished top 6. No, he would not. Because if he did not crash, once the rain came again at the end, he would not have pitted. He would have stayed out like Tsunoda, like Hamilton, like Leclerc, like Verstappen. And he would have lost a lot of places in the process. He would have finished ahead of Tsunoda, 11th place, just because he didn't pit at the right time. And that was because he would have YOLO'd staying out, because if he managed to stay out, he would have been in contention for a podium. That is the entire reason why I think no, Alonso would not have scored anything impressive today, even if he did not crash. Because Alonso would not have settled for just some placement, and he would have risked everything, like he did when he crashed.
But when he did risk it, do you not think it could have been top 6 then? If it had not led to a crash?
No, because he would have risked staying out in the wet on the dry tires. I mean, if he, okay, there is another question. If he doesn't crash, there is no safety car. Nobody pits for the dry tires. So how does the race develop? But my point still stands. I think Alonso would have taken as much risk as possible today, and so ultimately it would not have paid out. If it did, it would have been a podium place. By all means, yes. If the risk plays out, he would have been on the podium because that's exactly why he would have risked that. But usually, when you take such risks, they don't work out. 9 out of 10 times they fail.
Yeah, that was pretty comprehensive. So I don't have much to add to any of that, other than only thing I'll say about Aston is that their pit calls, their strategy was spot on, and that bodes well. They haven't always had the best strategies in the past, so the fact that they were able to put in some great calls and keep composure in a tough race shows that they have made some good progress in that department compared to some prior races in the past, and if that continues, it bodes very well for them.
So from one green team to another, kick Sauber. Clearly, the car has improved. They're probably in a similar position they were at the end of last season. I mean, Hülkenberg didn't quite make Q2. Bortoleto did, which was a bit of a surprise. Hülkenberg again. Well, mid-race they were just hovering in the lower midfield, not really contending for points. But then Hülkenberg stayed out of trouble. Experience again gets himself to 7th. That's a really good result for them. Is that better than? Because Joe Qatar wasn't it 7th last year, I think, or 7th or 8th is. So this is that's one of their best results for a long time. Bortoleto, though, yeah, he got passed by Antonelli at the start, and then in the rain, he gets the penalty for the unsafe release, and then crashes out in the rain. So not the best race from him.
Can I make a comment about the Sauber? I think Pinotto must be having a laugh now because his team scored more than Ferrari today.
With one driver.
Yeah. He will be having a laugh, but he also will realize that will quickly dissipate as the season goes on. So I doubt he'll take too much pleasure just from one race. I think that to sum up Kick Sauber's weekend, I think Bortoleto did a very good job for most of the weekend, and Hülkenberg was solid. So that was promising, given that they're both new to the team. We saw some other drivers who were new to their teams make big mistakes, but Nico did in a new environment, in a new car for the first time. He did a consistent job, and he slowly made up places as everybody else was running into things. And then, we forget how experienced this guy is. He's been in F1 for 15 years, which is unbelievable to think it was just yesterday when he was in the Williams. And he pitted for Inters right at the right time. It was perfectly judged. And I would say that he was struggling in the beginning as well. So he really maturely didn't overdrive. He didn't take a stupid risk. He just kept it on track, slow and steady. Safety car helped him out. Pitted at the right moment, and he got a bit lucky. But if you want to finish, first you must finish to finish in the points. First you must finish, and exactly what Sauber wanted from Nico Hülkenberg. This is exactly the kind of performance they hired him for. They did not hire him to be anonymous in these situations, and they did not hire him to be running into things. That's not what an experienced driver is supposed to do. So good job to him. He did a great job. And then with Bortoleto, I'll finish off my point here by saying the kid's got a lot of talent and aggression, and I think he just pushed too hard, touched the curb, and made a mistake. It's his first race, so he shouldn't be too sad about it. And I think Sauber executed really well today. So if they keep that up, and they keep and their car maintains a decent level of speed, it could be a good year for them compared to the past few seasons. So it looks like a driver lineup upgrade, and the team seems to have stepped up as well. So a good race.
And I feel like even though people are talking about how getting those points, they're not. It's going under the radar that these might, even if, as you said, Sauber has probably improved, these might genuinely be Sauber's only points for a while, if not the whole season. I wouldn't think so because they have improved. But when you see still how competitive the midfield is, if 5 drivers don't crash and Piastri doesn't end up in 10th and Ferrari doesn't mess up, Sauber is 12th, 13th, 14th. So yeah, these were massive points for sure, and I think that could you could still see those 6 points on the board at mid-season. Hopefully not for them, but I wouldn't be surprised if you still see Sauber 6 in 9th position during the summer break.
Absolutely.
So the next team is Alpine. Not an ideal race for them. Gasly was in the points. He was driving reasonably well, and then that one mistake at turn 1, he loses 3 positions, and that kills it, and he finishes 11th. Jack Doohan, a lap 1 crash. The car was going in a straight line. He just didn't catch it, and yeah, we all know what this means now for him, and I feel really bad for him.
So let's explain why we feel bad for Doohan. It's not just that it's his first race and that he, made a mistake and retired. It's also because we know that Flavio Briatore likely prefers to put Franco Colapinto in that seat. And Doohan is on a short leash, so to speak, in that if he makes too many mistakes, we think that Flavio will try to remove Doohan from the seat and put Franco in. So Doohan can't afford any mistakes. And ultimately, this was not the way he wanted to start. He showed good pace, though, during the weekend. The pace has been there. The Alpine car has been right in the thick of the midfield with Racing Bulls and Aston, as alluded earlier. And I will say that ultimately there were a lot of positives to take from Doohan's weekend in terms of raw speed. But it was just such tricky conditions. His teammate obviously is more experienced, Pierre Gasly, and was doing a good job. But then the conditions changed, and Pierre made a big mistake, as you mentioned, Peter. And I think a couple things. Some drivers who pitted earlier benefited from the rain shower, so that disadvantaged Gasly. But yeah, he made the mistake at the end of the day, so you can't blame Alpine too much for the result. Ultimately, Gasly finished 11th. You got to say that points were definitely possible given everything that happened today, and yeah, it was difficult conditions, but experience now. So he's got to make sure he cuts down on these kind of mistakes where he's costing his team points effectively. Not good enough. So it's a strange one. They'll be disappointed because they had no points from this, but they have a good car. They have a car that can fight for the bottom of the top 10 if they put everything together. So we'll see how that pans out for the rest of the season. But yeah, not a good start for Alpine in my view.
I hope that what we saw today, clearly today, is more of an anomaly. But if these were true also for the rest of the season, what I hope is that the midfield and the front runners aren't that far apart. Because if it is like last year, then the midfield is going to be absolutely merciless. It's going to be only the top 2 guys in the midfield ever scoring points at any given race. And this is just me. It means that we will never see Haas in the points. Probably today will be the only time we see Sauber scoring. And it's going to be an incredibly harsh battle between those 4 teams, between P5 and P8 in the performance ranking as we see it now. If instead the midfield and the front runners are actually quite close, then we get more interesting races. We get Williams sometimes challenging for P5. We get front runners actually getting punished if they aren't performing on any given weekend. We actually get maybe podiums from the midfield. Clearly, we got close today, a P5 from Albon, and I just hope that isn't the closest we ever get all year. And so this race was an anomaly. I hope this anomaly carries over for the entire rest of the year, because otherwise, it's going to be boring, man. It looks like McLaren is ahead of everybody by half a second. It looks like Ferrari is still screwing everything up, and they appear to be the only one who can ever challenge McLaren. Red Bull, for whatever reason, has one driver, because the other driver, whoever it may be, just cannot drive their car. And Mercedes, look, good and all, but probably today were the best conditions possible for Mercedes, and they were challenging for the victory.
Yeah, well said. I wonder what do you think about the ranking in the midfield? We touched on this earlier. Nav gave his viewpoint between Red
Okay,
Bull,
so
RB, Aston, and Alpine. Where do you think these cars stack up right now? I'll give you what I think. I think, sorry, Williams, RB, Aston, and Alpine. Those four teams. I personally think Williams is at the top of that pile, followed by RB, followed by Aston, followed by Alpine. What do you think?
I think we need more races because clearly Aston was nowhere in testing, and we already assessed that in the other podcast. And then they were fairly promising in Friday, but clearly Racing Bulls and Williams were better. Then in FP3 they were absolutely nowhere. Then come Q1 and Alonso is a legend apparently, fighting the front runners, don't know how, before screwing everything up in Q2 and in the race, the race is not really representative. So just Williams, clearly Sainz and Albon, we don't know how they stack up because I don't think Albon is better than Sainz, but Albon qualified P6, Sainz P9 or P10. I don't remember if he was ahead or not of
P10.
Gasly. P10 then. And so if Sainz actually is better than Albon, then he would have qualified on a proper day even better than Albon did. We get Alpine, who was Jack Doohan, who's a rookie, and Pierre Gasly, and again, Pierre Gasly is not the best driver ever in the history of Formula One. He's a solid driver, but really, just from one weekend, you cannot judge the performance of the car out of simply Gasly's performance, because Gasly is not that reliable of an indicator. And we get Racing Bulls, who again, it's same situation as Alpine, but even more extreme because Tsunoda is even less of an indicator on any given weekend. So I think we need more races just to since we cannot rely on the rookies, we need more races to see how Albon, Sainz, Gasly, and Tsunoda average out in the performance. And then we need a clear weekend from Aston, which they did not have this weekend. Right now, I would say the ranking is Aston, Williams, Aston, Racing Bulls, Williams, Alpine.
I mean, look, I think Alonso was so unbelievably quick in that Q1 session, which is why I can't believe I'm saying this. I'm actually disappointed he made a mistake in qualifying and then made a mistake in the race because I would have liked to seen him in cleaner conditions with a cleaner weekend in these conditions to see exactly how fast he could have gone. Because that Q1 lap he did in qualifying was the lap of the session. It came from absolutely nowhere, in my opinion. And then he was set to do it again in Q2, and he made that mistake. So I think you're right on that. You could be right that Aston is heading that group, and it shows you that they were sandbagging a bit in testing, and we'll have to see what happens for the remainder of the season. But to wrap that up, I think Alpine they got some work to do, but it's a firm midfield fight. So it really comes down to the drivers and the team to make the difference, and it's going to be exciting to watch. Anybody could come out on top in that 4-team battle from what we've seen.
So
the
last
team
segment on us.
Sorry, what was that, Ace?
You were saying, so to conclude, and I was gonna say, didn't we skip over Haas? Haven't we gonna cover them?
I was just doing this transition.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So sorry.
Right, that's another cut then. So the team that is last in every possible way is Haas. It looks like they've kind of gone back 2 years in terms of pace because, I mean, Behrman, he crashed in practice, gearbox dies, doesn't set a lap time, starts in the pit lane. Ocon still qualifies last anyway. In the race, we only see them when they're getting lapped, and otherwise they just don't do much. The pace is not there. They've kind of taken the spot that Sauber had last year, which is quite disappointing in many ways.
Yeah. Look, I want to be respectful. Formula One is a difficult sport. Formula One is the pinnacle of motorsport. I believe it is the best sport in the world. So everyone who's in Formula One should be proud of themselves, except Haas, because ultimately that was embarrassing. There's no reason for this team to be so far behind. And ultimately, all that good news we thought Ayao Komatsu was responsible for last year, the fact that they were gaining speed as the season went on, they looked more organized, that just went down the drain because not only do they have two new drivers who I don't think were exactly maximizing their cars, one of them is a rookie who was running into things. No disrespect to Oliver Behrman. He's not even a true rookie. He's actually done a few races before. So starting off with that, Behrman, not good enough. And in the race, he did better. He did execute the race and he was showing some speed, but Ocon the same. It's just that fundamentally speaking, that car is not anything other than the slowest right now. And when the safety car came out, I remember everybody put dry tires on, and Haas, I guess, took a gamble and kept both drivers on the inters. The rain didn't come, so then they had to stop again a second time for dry tires.
Mm.
And then that destroyed their race. So, I'll just finish my piece on Haas by saying that the only good thing they got is that both drivers finished, which means they got data. But it's clear they have the worst car on the grid, and Ayao Komatsu has to take some responsibility and now find a way to quickly improve that because, frankly speaking, that's just totally unacceptable. They were way off the pace.
They, because in testing, they were one of two teams that brought intermediates and actually got to do a little bit of wet weather testing. Yeah, ironically enough, we get some rain and they're the worst team by quite a considerable margin.
Mm-hmm.
They did one lap on the interim testing.
Even so,
well, it's something. It's still one more than everyone else.
I think the point is that this team just, it's obvious their car is either they've made a mistake with the car, it's just not as quick as the others. So, they have they needed to finish to get data for their car. So that's the positive. They finished, they have long run data, but they have two drivers that have never driven in the team before. So that's going to hold them back, in my opinion, because they can't say, oh, this is how it felt last year, this is how it feels now. I mean, ultimately, Behrman could provide that, but he's so inexperienced that you've got to question his feedback at this point in his career. And I really didn't like what I saw from Ollie in the first few sessions. He just looked really nervous and error prone. He needs to cut that out because, in F1, you don't get too many chances these days. So Ocon is in a position where it's just so hard to judge his performance right now because Behrman is just still getting to grips with Formula One. And because Ocon's in the worst car, if he finishes second last, nobody's going to say he did a bad job unless he made a clear mistake, because that's where the car should finish. So, yeah, I'm sure Esteban's not happy. He probably expected something better than this, but he was also forced in a way to leave Alpine, and this is going to be his toughest challenge yet. This is going to be a tough year. So I'd like to see Ocon really step up as a leader and take the reins. Hopefully he fills that role. But yeah, unacceptable. By far the worst team on the grid this weekend.
Yeah, I mean, Haas will get a very rude awakening when Cadillac turn up and they're better than them next year. They're just, if it's going to be like this for the rest of the year, it's like we just don't need them. It's been been nearly 10 years of just depression and sadness and misery coming out of that team.
Yep.
Absolutely do not agree that the next year Cadillac is going to be better. So next year, both are going to have Ferrari engines. And Ferrari doesn't... Of course, we don't expect Ferrari next year to bring a disappointing engine. So they may fight for actual stuff, for actual points, maybe even podiums, so if there are enough crazy races in 2026. But you've got to understand, Haas has the experience of always using everything possible from Ferrari. Cadillac is absolutely a new team who's bringing... which drivers will they bring? We still don't know. But one driver is going to be from IndyCar. And I just don't see how Haas could perform worse than Cadillac in the first year, given that their their cars are not going to be that much different from one another since they take as much as possible from Ferrari. And on this fact that they have as much as possible from Ferrari, I also want to go back to this weekend and say some good news, some hope for the team, is that today we saw wet weather, and they tested just long runs in testing, only dry. So maybe the car, yes, sucks in qualifying, but it kept all the good characteristics it had last year in tire management, in race pace. So maybe next weekend they're still gonna be out in Q1, but then in the race they can have an excellent race pace. That could be possible. We will see. It's just hopeful wishing for now, but it may happen. And the other good piece of news is that, other two pieces of good news is that one, we saw so many mistakes from Oliver Behrman today, this weekend, and it's actually very fortunate that it happened this weekend because there was nothing to lose. And it's fortunate that it didn't happen in the 3 races last year. And if this wishful thinking actually turns out in reality, then it's fortunate that it didn't happen in any of the following races. Next weekend, we do not expect rain in China, at Shanghai, so it's going to be dry race. And last piece of good news, of hopeful wishing, is that if it is true that the Haas is just a worse version of the Ferrari because it takes as much as possible from the Ferrari, then it means that if the Ferrari is still a competitive front-runner car and the Haas is the worst of the grid, then it just means that the grid, in performance-wise, is very close, it is very tight. And so, if it is true, it is very good for the grid. Not for us, but for the entertainment purpose, it would be very good if it were true. The other case scenario is that actually the Ferrari this year sucks, and because the Haas is just a worse version of the Ferrari, it sucks even more. Like 2021 and 2020, the Haas was nowhere because the Ferrari wasn't competitive. As soon as Ferrari was competitive again in 2022, the Haas was competitive in 2022. Then the Ferrari was less competitive in 2023, Haas was less competitive in 2023. So if this pattern continues, and there are these two possibilities right now. We will see in the following races.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that, frankly. I think all good points, and exciting to see how things develop as the season goes on.
Yeah. So let's wrap this up then with tops and flops. So tops for me, fairly straightforward. I think it's Antonelli, Max, and Lando.
I think that's a good top 3. I am going to go with a different ranking. I'll go Max 1, Albon, and Russell, because these were the 3 drivers that generally just didn't make mistakes in the race. Antonelli made mistakes in the race, even though he finished high up, he still made mistakes. Lando made mistakes. So I wouldn't include them personally, but I'm open to changing my mind. But I just think those 3, in that order, Max, Albon, and Russell, were generally flawless, weren't they? There was never a moment where they were like off the road or spinning, from what I can remember. So, I mean, Peter, what do you have to say to that? Maybe I'm missing something. Why Lando and Antonelli?
Well, Lando basically he controlled it very well. I mean, he made the same mistake as Oscar, but recovered better from it, and was able to. I mean, he was getting pressured a lot at the start and again at the end by Max, and kept it together even with carrying damage at the end. Antonelli, yes, he qualified badly, but then he made the most overtakes in the race out of anybody, and it's like gaining 12 positions is quite a significant achievement for your first race.
Okay. Yeah, I could go with that instead. I mean, Albon and Russell were kind of just very consistent, maybe less spectacular. So I could replace them with Antonelli and Norris. I'm fine with that. But I'll keep Max as my number 1 as the driver of the day officially.
My top 3 is going to be Max, Russell, and Lando. So Max and Russell because they generally had a very lean weekend, and Max ahead of Russell because, Max was incredible. Russell was more anonymous. Anyway, neither made any glaring big mistakes, so both top 2. And then I choose Lando over Albon because Albon, I don't really know where to place the Williams, and so I'm at a loss at how to judge his performance, because strictly speaking, he was out-qualified by Tsunoda. So if the Williams is better than the Racing Bulls, it means Albon underperformed in quali. So it didn't matter because he finished P5, but still, I don't know where to place the Williams, so I prefer to give P3 to Lando to show the appreciation for what he did. Okay, he wasn't perfect, he made obvious mistakes, but he managed to win a race in hard conditions, which was not given. It was not given that he would have won, and he still managed to win out of a more competitive car. He managed to win. He wasn't even doing that last year, so this is a clear step up from last year, and I want to reflect that by putting him top 3.
You know what? I'm going to go back to my ranking then as well. I didn't realize we're all going to give separate ones. So Peter made a really good argument, but I'm just going to go with Max, George, and I'm going to include Albon then, because I think he was roughly where the Williams was. That's actually exactly what I was thinking, that's roughly where the Williams should be, right behind the top 4, sorry. And that's where Albon generally was, even if he got out-qualified by a sensational lap by Tsunoda. So I think we're all similar anyways in our line of thinking. So the one consistency across all our rankings is Max Verstappen. So that really suggests he was the driver of the day.
For then flops, I'm going to keep it easy and if not a bit boring. Hadjar, Doohan, and Sainz.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I think Hadjar, unfortunately, that was so unfortunate. Doohan as well, that was a bit, avoidable. And I'm gonna go with probably with Sainz. The reason I don't put Alonso there is because apparently there was gravel where Alonso was driving, so it was a driver error, but it was more understandable. With Sainz, it was okay. He has an issue with the upshifts, but you still need to be on top of that. You shouldn't really be crashing because of an upshift difference from your previous cars. So I think I generally agree with you. Actually, you know what, Peter? I'm gonna go with Piastri. I'm sorry. I'm going to go with Piastri instead of Sainz because even though Oscar came back and fought his way back, he's got the fastest car in F1, and he made a huge mistake. That was a clear win or podium that he threw away. So Hadjar, Doohan, Piastri for me.
You know what? You make an excellent point about Piastri. I'm going to steal him. So for me, the flop is going to be Formula 3. They didn't run it. And even if they did, I heard the qualifying was a mess and drivers couldn't set times because of too many red flags. So Formula 3 was a flop. I'm going to go with Piastri because obviously he made a big mistakes despite having the best car on the grid. And then as the biggest flop, I'd say Hadjar. It must be heartbreaking. That guy was so happy that he got a seat after he was devastated for losing the title of Formula 2. Comes back, says, I'm so happy. I don't even care about losing the title because I get to drive a Formula 1. And then he spans out turn 2 of the formation lap. That's wow, very harsh. Luca Badoer didn't get a seat at Benetton because he crashed out in turn 1. And Hadjar turn 2 of a formation lap.
And this is someone else who basically threw the F3 title by crashing in qualifying, and then he stalled at the start of the Abu Dhabi race in F2 last year and cost that title as well. So that seems to be a recurring theme because he never, as I said before, he has no titles in karting or single seaters, and he's the only driver on the grid that for which that is the case. Yeah, overall, amazing race. There seems to have been a degree of I'm getting a degree of cynicism or pessimism from you two, but for me, it's like, okay, McLaren may dominate this, but as it is, I think things are set up very well, and we have a lot to look forward to this year.
I don't know. I think you're right on that, but what worries me, Peter, is everything you said was incredibly valid there. I think what worries me is just that pace advantage McLaren had before the safety car and the weather change. They had the full length of a pit straight within 20 laps. That is, if it's a dry race with no strategic variation, I don't see any other result than McLaren just romping away. And I just don't know if that's going to lead to an interesting season. But the way it's set up now, we have some things to look forward to, some plot lines to see unveiled and develop as the season goes on. So let's keep an optimistic point of view. You know, a lot could still happen. I'm just a little worried about McLaren space. That's all.
I actually look forward this season to the flexi wing change in regulations at June before Spain, because I really hope it completely scrambles the pecking order. You know, maybe not mixing midfield runners with front runners, but scrambling the order within these macro orders. Okay, came out wrong. And I look forward to the Aston Martin upgrade that will come in June, hopefully with some help by Newey, because I just can no longer bear that whenever Alonso seems a little bit competitive, Ciaron can just write, "We fear Fernando," and completely obliterates with those 3 words his weekend.
I mean, look, he was. I sensed. People think I was kidding. I sensed he was hiding his pace a little bit, and there's a running joke that when I say we fear Alonso, it jinxes him and he does badly. But I do fear him because that lap he did in Q1 was amazing, and we remember the champion after that lap. So let's see what happens in China. In fact, after McLaren, there is a lot to look forward to. So that's just one of the many things I'll be looking for in the races to come.
Yeah, I mean, this year it seems likely that it's going to be a title battle between Lando and Oscar, which means that the no doubt impending Prost-Senna comparisons are probably going to drive me off social media. But even so, bring on China. You've been listening to the DRS Train podcast. We're on YouTube and Spotify, and you can find us on Instagram and X at the DRS Train podcast. Make sure to tune in for our next episode. Stay safe, and we'll see you all next time.